On Sunday, November 21st, voters in Chile will go to the polls to elect a new president, along with 27 new senators and all 155 seats in the Chamber of Deputies. In order to understand the political landscape in Chile leading up to the election, EGAP has convened a panel of Chilean political scientists to give their thoughts on the main issues at stake, as well as the implications of the election. I'm Matt Lysecki, the Senior Methods Manager at EGAP, and I would like to welcome our panelists. Fernando Rosenblatt is an Associate Professor of Political Science at the Universidad Diego Portales in Santiago, and is also a member of the EGAP network. His research focuses on party system institutionalization, party activism, party organizations, governance, and the political economy. Hi, Fernando.
Hi, Matt.
And Cristóbal Rovira Kaltwasser is a professor of political science at the Universidad Diego Portales and is an associate researcher at the Center for Social Conflict and Cohesion Studies. His research primarily focuses on the ambivalent relationship between populism and democracy. Hi, Cristóbal.
Hi, Matt. Thanks for the invitation.
Yeah, thank you both for joining us. So to start out, there are 7 candidates running for president this year in Chile, 4 of whom are the primary contenders. According to the polls, there has been movement in the past couple of months regarding who the top candidates are to succeed the current president, Sebastián Piñera. Could you walk us through who the main figures are in this election, their general ideological positions, and their chances at winning?
Well, if I may start, Fernando, I would say that of these, there are in fact 4 candidates that, according to the polls, have chances of probably going to the ballotage. And these are on the right-wing camp, Sebastián Sichel and José Antonio Cast. And on the center-left camp, this is Gabriel Boric and Jasna Proboste. So I will talk briefly about the ones on the mainstream right, and probably Fernando, who knows much more, can talk about of the ones on the center-left. So on the mainstream, on the right-wing camp, you have on the one hand Sebastián Sichel, who has been endorsed by the 3 mainstream right parties of the country, and these are the 3 parties that are behind the current government of Sebastián Piñera. And there is another candidate on the right-wing bloc whose name is José Antonio Cast, and he has a brand new party called Partido Republicano, and which is sort of equivalent of the populist radical right that we have seen in many other countries of the world. In fact, the agenda of José Antonio Cast and Partido Republicano is similar to the agenda of Jair Bolsonaro in Brazil, Donald Trump in the United States, and many other populist radical right countries across the world. Whereas in the case of Sebastián Sichel, his agenda is much more the classical one of a mainstream right candidate. So this means he's in favor of the free market and is relatively conservative on moral issues, but much more in a moderate way rather than in a radical way. So of these 2 candidates, according to the polls, Sebastián Sichel started relatively good at the polls, but he started to go down relatively fast in the last few weeks. And I would say that nobody really thinks that he has strong chances of getting into the ballotage. We might see a surprise, but according to the polls, he might get roughly 10% of the vote, according to the last polls that we have. And the rising star is José Antonio Cast, who is polling between, depends on the different polls, but there are some that are saying that he might get even 30% of the vote in the first round. Others are saying that he will get roughly 20% of the vote. So, and the positions, again, of José Antonio Cast are very radical, both on moral issues, on also in terms of the free market. He's also politicizing the issue of immigration. And in this sense, again, it's pretty similar to populist radical right figures that we have seen in other places of the world. And just to finish, I think that if he's able to get into the ballotage, the key question is whether for the second round, he will try to moderate his agenda or whether he will continue with a very radical agenda. My feeling is that he's not willing to compromise and he will stick to a very hardcore radical agenda. And this will certainly diminish the chances of getting elected in the second round. But the big elephant in the room in Chile is to note who is going to vote, because turnout level in this country is very low. And I think that José Antonio Cast is very good at mobilizing his own base. And if the center left is not good at mobilizing the base of the center left, it could be the case, I'm just theorizing, that might get elected in the second round. But again, I don't think that this will be possible because a lot of Chileans are in favor of his agenda. I think this might be possible much more because he's able to mobilize a very a segmented, only a segment of the electorate who is in favor of his agenda.
If I could add two minor things to what Cristóbal just mentioned about José Antonio Cast is, first is that compared to Bolsonaro, for example, he's not that able, and Trump, we don't know yet whether he's able to mobilize a popular vote, right? We don't know that. So I agree with Cristóbal in terms that he seems to be mobilizing what has traditionally been the vote from the right in rich areas and senior voters. Also, I would say that he's touching a nerve, and this happened like yesterday, right? Sort of like reigniting the authoritarian democratic cleavage, right? So being pro or against Pinochet. He made some very strong remarks about defending the Pinochet regime and his legacy with foreign correspondents. In terms of the center left and the left, what we see is on the left, Gabriel Boric. According to the polls, he's the leading candidate, and he represents the coalition Apruebo Dignidad. This is a coalition between the Communist Party and the Frente Amplio, the Broad Front, the Chilean Broad Front, that it's essentially composed of new parties, new organizations that emerged after the student movement mobilizations in 2011, and other minor groups and parties. That's the left, that's Gabriel Boric, and his agenda it's essentially a progressive agenda, right? And according to the polls, he's the leading candidate. But the problem here is that we are in a context of deinstitutionalization of the party system in Chile, and actually we don't know exactly what's the social base of all these candidates, all these movements in the current situation, right? Not only because this has been a problem, a gradual problem over the last decade, this detachment between the parties and society, and this has essentially collapsed after the social unrest in 2019, the social mobilizations, the social protests that I'm sure all know about. In the center left, what we see is Jasna Proboste. She's the candidate of the Christian Democracy, and she's the candidate of the former Concertación parties, this coalition that governed Chile after the authoritarian regime from 1990 until 2010. But the thing is that this is a weakened version of that coalition, right? Essentially in terms of its connection with society, and they have been severely challenged with the social unrest in 2019. I mean, they are in the same bag with the center right. They are all being like pointed as responsible for not implementing the changes that Chilean society needs, right? But we don't know what might happen. I mean, the key question here, as Cristóbal said, is voter turnout and who will vote. Not just the amount of voters. We might expect below 50%, 48, 47, 49% of the voters, but the composition of the voting, right? For example, how will how it's going to be the turnout in poor neighborhoods, right? Usually you get there around 30-35% of the votes, but for the constitutional plebiscite that we had in last year, you have there a surge in voting, and also a surge in voting from the youth. Those two voters might explain an increasing vote for the leftist candidate Gabriel Boric. If our hypothesis on the inability of José Antonio Cast to mobilize the popular voters, as opposed to other examples in Europe or the US, is right.
Thanks.
For example, what I'm saying is it is not clear, for example, as opposed to Jair Bolsonaro in Brazil, that José Antonio Cast is able to mobilize the evangelical voters, for example.
Gotcha. No, that makes sense. So on the kind of the note of the context of this election, in 2019, Chile was rocked by a massive months-long social uprising that reconfigured the political landscape and precipitated a process to rewrite the constitution, which was drafted in 1980 under the dictatorship of Augusto Pinochet. What has this landscape meant for the current state of democratic representation in Chile? And how has Chile's political party landscape changed in response to this social movement?
Well, again, this is a big question, but I think to try to make a long story short, I think Fernando already mentioned some of the key concepts here. I think Chile is experiencing a crisis of democratic representation, and Chile is amidst a process of deinstitutionalization, but probably we don't know, of reinstitutionalization, in the sense that we are seeing a reconfiguration of the political landscape. Just think about Jose Antonio Cast that we were talking briefly. I mean, this is a brand new party. I mean, it appeared a couple of years ago, and apparently he's able to mobilize, let's say, 1/3 of the electorate. But we need to see what is going to happen in the parliamentary elections, because as you mentioned at the beginning, Matt, this is a presidential election and a parliamentary election.
Right.
It could be the case that maybe he is going to do relatively well in the presidential election, but I think that his list at the parliament is not going to get too many votes, which will reinforce the argument that right-wing voters in general, they're voting for him, but not necessarily for the whole project that he's supporting. I think many right-wingers are saying, so my candidate, who is Sebastián Sichel, so the mainstream right candidate, doesn't have any chance of getting elected. This is why I don't want to lose my vote, just strategic voting. I will vote for Jose Antonio Cast, but maybe at the parliamentary level, this is not going to happen. But this is one of the crucial questions that we need to see after the election. And I think on the center-left bloc, it happens something similar, that because of this reinstitutionalization or deinstitutionalization of the party system, we need to see what happens with those, for example, that vote for Gabriel Boric will also vote for the list that he has put together for the parliament, or to what extent the all center left, so the Christian Democrats and the Socialist Party, will be able to get many people elected. And I think this is one of the things that we need to look at after the election. I think we need to focus not only on the parliamentary election, not only on the presidential election, also on the parliamentary election, because this will allow us to try to better grasp to what extent this political landscape is moving, and is moving in which directions, so to say.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I essentially agree. I would say that what we've seen with the social protests, with the mobilizations in 2019 was the epilogue of a decade or more than a decade of the detachment between institutionalized politics and society, right? That reached a tipping point in 2019, and it happened what we know it happened, right? So it only precipitated a process of deinstitutionalization, a process of fragmentation, and the inability of parties to channel politics, to channel demands, to channel emerging demands, essentially, and also to legitimize the political process. I mean, whenever you have a policy decision, are politicians able to legitimize that with those decisions with its base? And the answer is no. And the clear example here is that all those who signed the agreement in Congress, the established parties and the Congress members that signed the agreement, which led to the constitutional process that we are in right now, were treated as traitors. For example, Gabriel Boric himself was treated as a traitor by those who were in the streets. Actually, a few days after he signed the agreement, he suffered an attack. They throw him eggs and water and whatnot. There was a terrible image, right? That sort of like symbolizes what's going on right now in Chile. And I am quite pessimistic in whether the constitutional process by itself will be able to re-institutionalize the political process here in Chile. I think this is more a problem of political organizations and political agency. And you don't see a political agent who is able to channel this and to channel the protest, not in the right and not in the left. Because again, for me, Jose Antonio Cast is a radical right candidate, etc. But I'm not sure. We don't know yet, but I'm not sure if he sort of like can become a populist leader who can connect with a populist movement, right? And build a populist movement from there. And this also does not happen in the left. All these movements that were elected as independents for the constitutional process do not have, according to my research that we are conducting with Rafael Piñeiro, Verónica Pérez, and Ligüen Nocheto, that we are conducting research on these independent groups and candidates, you don't see a dense organizational network below those candidacies as well. So that's a problem in terms of aggregating demands, right? And re-legitimizing the political process here in Chile.
So speaking of that kind of connection between party politics and the constitutional process, what's the relationship between the ongoing constitutional process and the upcoming presidential election? The new president will be elected to serve under a still unknown constitution. How have the candidates dealt with this uncertainty?
Well, I would think that so far they're dealing in a very positive way because they haven't been elected. I think, and in theory, it's pretty easy to say, well, I'm in favor of this constitutional process, let's see what happens. I think the real problem will start once a new president gets into power. I mean, the new president will get into power by March next year, and the constitutional process should end by the end of the year with the realization of a referendum. But one of the crucial questions, and we don't know what is going to happen, but one of the crucial questions is whether the new constitution will establish a new electoral cycle. And which I mean here, it seems pretty obvious that the constitution will make some institutional changes on how, for example, the parliament is going to work. There is this open question whether we will move towards a sort of semi-presidential system, whether, for example, we might have only one chamber instead of two chambers. But if these type of changes will be established in the new constitution, it could be the case that the Constitutional Assembly says we will call for elections in, let's say, 2023 for a complete restarting of the political system. And if something like this happens, I can imagine that the president in power will be not very happy with that, particularly if the person in power is José Antonio Kast, because we need to remember that he said from the beginning that he's against changing the constitution. So this is why I think this is a good question, but it's a tricky one because it depends a lot on who is going to be elected and also to what extent the new constitution will make big changes or small changes on the political system.
And I completely agree. I have nothing to add here. I would just say that the story even doesn't end there. The problem also, so it's a very challenging juncture for Chilean politics, right? You might have a president that it's against the constitutional process that it's undergoing in parallel, or in the best case scenario, you will have a president that supports that, but who is not, who might be challenged in his power. But the story doesn't end there. Remember, this constitutional process began as a result of those social mobilizations, social protests that didn't have the constitutional reform as the first and foremost demand. It was like, there were like very diverse demands in the streets in 2019, right? Pension reform, education reform, health reform, etc. The political leaders channeled that with opening the path to a constitutional reform. The problem here is that the demands are still there. And these mobilizations were only stopped by the pandemic. Because after the signature of the agreement in November, you still had protests. December, January, February, you still had like very intense mobilizations and protests. It was not that the agreement like turned off the protest. The only thing that turned off the protest was the pandemic. So the challenge here is not only signing a new constitution, drafting a new constitution, but translating that new constitution, that new institutional framework in policies, which are actually the demands of the Chilean population. And that might take time, not only time, but also politics. And if you don't have stable parties or stable coalitions, at least, at the very least, right? And you don't have stable coalitions at this point, right? You have like many problems within the left, between the Communist Party and the Frente Amplio. You have the challenges with the Christian Democrats and the center left. So you have challenges everywhere. The problem is that these demands might be reignited, frustration might be reignited, and you don't have like this horizon of toppling down the Pinochet constitution. You don't have like any escape valve to go to, right? So it's the next decade for Chile is going to be very challenging in terms of politics.
Thanks for speaking a little bit more about the relationship between Chilean society and the political process, and then also kind of how COVID fits into all of that as it's kind of the dominant story of the year worldwide. Cristóbal, anything you want to add about the role of kind of COVID in the relationship between society and the political process?
Well, maybe something short to add, and this is a working hypothesis again. I mean, we know that in the last two elections that we had, and this was first for for approving or not the new constitution, and second for selecting who is going to represent the people in the Constituent Assembly. In these two last elections, we had a reshuffling of those who participate. Fernando already mentioned that. We have a bit more younger people going to the political process, and we had a bit more lower class citizens being engaged. One working hypothesis of why elderly are voting less might be related to the COVID-19 pandemic. If this argument is true, we might expect that for the election of this Sunday, because the pandemic is now relatively under control and because the vaccination process in Chile has been relatively successful, it could be this case that those elderly who stayed at home for the last two elections, this time will go to the polls. And this might have, again, an impact on the political process. But this is just to show, again, why predicting these days is so difficult in Chile, because you have so many different variables. And I would say that the COVID-19 pandemic is one variable more that makes the prediction even more complicated.
Sure. So moving into some different topics. In terms of economics, inflation is currently on the rise in Chile, and there are signals that the market is worried about the short-term prospects of the Chilean economy. How have economic concerns affected the lead up to the election thus far?
Well, I think that the summary that you make is true. I mean, we are living in a sort of a bubble at the moment because the economic process is relatively doing well. If you look Chile, I mean, GDP is going up, inflation it's going a bit up, and this is generating some anxiety. But I think the toughest period will start next year, because then we'll have a new budget, we'll have a new government, and the whole stimulus package will be over. And it looks very clear that whoever gets into power will have a difficult economic scenario. And this is happening all over the world, but I think in Chile, it's getting a bit more complicated because of this whole uncertainty related to the constitutional process. So I think that the market, to a certain extent, is trying to figure out what happens if José Antonio Cast wins on the one side, on Boric wins on the other side. And my interpretation, I will try to be as objective as possible, but I think my interpretation that the bet of the market on José Antonio Cast, it's a very tricky bet, because there are some people related to much more to the business community who are saying, well, José Antonio Cast is promising a bit like the agenda of Donald Trump, do you know, like more economic flexibility, lowering taxes, and he will generate economic growth. And it could be the case that if he gets elected, he might be able to secure some economic growth in the short term. But the level of conflict, if he gets elected, is going to be so high that this will endanger political stability, and this might have a huge impact on also economic stability in the long term. So, and I think this is what I can add, at least from the side of the case of José Antonio Cast. Maybe Fernando wants to say something more in the case that Boric gets elected.
Yeah,
I agree. I agree. And the problem you have here is that you have this very, very complicated combination of like enduring political instability, right? Macroeconomic uncertainty, institutional uncertainty. So it's like a terrible cocktail, right? It's a terrible combination. And also you have like very, very, very intense demands from society that, again, are still there. And and you have this conflict, right? If you are Boric, you have like these demands and you have this agenda on the one hand, and on the other hand, you have this business elite that are really, really anxious about the dimensions of the changes that he is proposing, essentially tax reform, right? And structural reforms in terms of pensions, in terms of health, the health system, etc. So again, uncertainty, macroeconomic uncertainty is now very. You have a lot of macroeconomic uncertainty for the near future, and that doesn't help the inflation expectations and also the prospect for policy reform as well, right?
Sure. So changing gears a little bit again, on November 3rd, Gabriel Boric tested positive for COVID-19. How has this impacted his level of involvement and engagement with the other candidates during the closing weeks of the election?
Well, my feeling, I don't know, I haven't discussed it with Fernando previously, but my feeling is it didn't have a major impact. It's my interpretation. What is interesting is in Chile, the last 2 weeks before the election, there is, it's prohibited to show polls. I mean, polls are being conducted probably, but they cannot do publicity about that. And I think the whole political debate was centered about who is going up and down. And now that Gabriel Boric had COVID, I mean, he couldn't go to some debates, for example, and something like that. But because the polling stopped to a certain extent, or at least the debate about the polling, I think now we are in another phase of the political debate. And this is why I think that the whole issue about the COVID-19 involvement of Boric didn't have like a huge impact. That's my feeling, at least.
And also, again, we've been having elections, many elections over the last year and a half. And so politicians are also very well trained to conduct campaigns online, right? Sure. They have become very versed in using all these information and communication technologies to reach voters and to mobilize and organize. So political campaigning has been very intense, right? I mean, everywhere has been intense in using social networks, etc. But in Chile, I think it reached another level given the intensity of the campaign and the stakes, right? Last year we were voting for candidates for the new constitutional convention, and so it's been many elections and many very critical elections, right, going on under the pandemic. So they are already well trained in doing campaigning online.
That makes sense. So we've talked about COVID, we've talked about the new constitution, we've talked a bit about the economy. What are a few of the other major issues at the forefront of this election? And then as you mentioned those, please let us know where the major candidates stand in regard to those issues.
Well, I think there are many different issues that we can talk about, but to keep it brief, I think there are two issues that are relevant nowadays, I would say. The first issue that I think it's very problematic, and this is a common issue across of Latin America, is security. I mean, there is a huge anxiety across the population with issues related to public security. And because of the whole social movement that exploded in 2019, this started to get even more salient for some sectors of society. And part of the success of José Antonio Caz is related to that. He has been very good at politicizing that issue. Yeah. And I think that the center-left, that this is a common problem for all center-left parties and candidates across of Latin America, don't have good policies on that. I think it's a tricky issue to be solved anyway. But again, part of the reason of why José Antonio Caz is doing good on the policies is because he's politicizing that with this iron fist campaign, so to say, whereas in the case of Boric, he also says and acknowledges that public security is an issue, but the agenda that he's proposing, it's not very convincing, at least for large sections of the electorate. And the other issue that is interestingly getting a bit more of attention is migration. And again, here, José Antonio Caz has been very good at politicizing that with an agenda that's similar to the one of Jair Bolsonaro and Donald Trump, and which is saying that we need to close borders, we need to regulate migration. And Gabriel Boric is much more on the other side, saying like, we have an issue with migration, but we need to keep like certain international standards about how we deal with that. But these are, again, two issues. These are not the only ones, but there are two issues that are getting a bit more of traction now in the last days of the elections, I would say.
And I would say, I agree, I completely agree. And I would say that this is something that has changed since October 2019, right? In October 2019, the politicization of inequality, the politicization of health reform, pension reform, education, gave way now, and you have like now this increasing politicization of insecurity, macroeconomic stability. And why? Because it's the combination of political instability and the pandemic that raised fear, and the increasing in unemployment rates, et cetera, that brought into the table these kind of issues that are typical issues that are raised in times of crisis, right? And one point regarding immigration, people should understand that Chile has changed a lot in terms of migration. This was a country that was not used to receive waves of migrants, right? As it's been in the last decade. So the migration rate changed like drastically in the last 10 years. And it's not just for people from Venezuela, it's also from Colombia, Dominican Republic, Haiti. So it used to have a strong immigration population from Peru, right? And a few from Bolivia. But now you have like this massive migration from Colombia, Venezuela, and it changed the setting in many cities, especially in popular communes, popular neighborhoods, right? And you have this dynamic that you also see in Paris and other European cities in this interaction between migrants and the working class in the outskirts of these metropolitan cities.
Well, that's it as far as questions I have prepared for both of you. Before we wrap up, I want to invite Cristóbal and Fernando to jump in with any final kind of closing thoughts beyond what we've discussed thus far.
Again, just to reiterate what we have been discussing before, I think this is a crucial election in Chile. There is a lot of stake. This is a period of huge instability. And the $1 million question that nobody can answer, it's what Fernando summarized very good, it's turnout. And it's not only how many people it's going to vote, but also which kind of people it's going to vote. And what is even trickier, and we know that from previous election, it might be also a change between the first ballot and the second ballot, and the first election now and the ballotage. So it might be that some of the people that participate in the first round of the elections will not participate in the second one and the other way around. And this is why making predictions these days is pretty complicated. So let's tune and see what happens on these 2 dates of the election.
I agree. And to complement that, I would say that, I mean, the problem of turnout, it's a problem in every country where you have voluntary voting, right? It's a problem for the US, right? The key issue here is the combination between voluntary voting and the process of deinstitutionalization of the party system and the break between parties and society. So you don't know actually who is able to mobilize, to organize and mobilize voters, right? So you don't know actually, and most of the parties and most of the candidates don't have that capacity. That increases the question on who is actually going to turn out to vote in such a critical election.
All right. Well, thank you, Fernando. Thank you, Cristóbal. Really appreciate the time you've both taken to walk us through issues related to this election. For more from EGAP, including more from our series on upcoming elections, please visit us at egap.org. Take care.
Bye. Thank you.